most of the most important things that I have learned came from failure and like embarrassing and punishing failure.
Welcome to Live Rich, Have Fun, Save the World, a podcast focused on reimagining how we define success. Co-hosted by myself, Monte Barnard, and CEO of Expensify, David Barrett. Ries is an entrepreneur, New York Times bestselling author of The Lean Startup, and currently the CEO of the Long-Term Stock Exchange, a public market option for companies and investors who share a long-term vision. Eric, thanks so much for joining us here today.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We want to talk about a couple different topics today, but to get us started, your career has been defined by challenging conventional wisdom. What's the first time you can remember feeling you were right when everyone else was wrong?
That's a funny way to start, because I was one of those kids that grew up feeling that way all the time. So actually my challenge was to learn that sometimes actually other people can be right too, and develop a little humility. And what was shocking to me, really shocking to me, was when I first entered into business, into programming, into software, I thought I was doing everything right according to, the way you see it on TV and in magazines about what it means to start a company, to build software, to have it be successful. And I was actually genuinely shocked that my life didn't follow the movie script. So, like the first time I started a company, pretty much everybody who I knew told me it was a bad idea. And, the most fun part of an entrepreneurship movie is at the end, where the protagonist gets to go back to all those people and say, "See, I told you so, you should never have doubted me." Well, in real life, if you've never had this experience, I really don't recommend it. You go back, you have to say, "Listen, you were right. I shouldn't have dropped out of school. I shouldn't have done, sorry, yeah, you were right. Okay, I guess it didn't work out." And, so I had to have quite a few of those experiences before I started to realize that life is not a movie, and success is not defined in conventional terms either. So it was definitely a learning process and journey for me.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned learning that humility. Here at Expensify, we talk about the 3 core qualities we're looking for when we're hiring people. So we don't look at experience, we don't care where you've worked, don't care where you went to school, any of that. We just care first, do you have talent? Do you have the ability to learn without being taught? That's number one. Second would be, do you have ambition? Do you actually want to do something with your life? Because if you don't want to do something with your life, then you're not going to want to do something with our life as well. And so the third, but in the first 2 of those, the first one's pretty easy to interview for. Talent, you can just measure that. Ambition, we have ideas, ways to sort of tease it out of people. The third and the most important, however, is just humility. The ability to, the genuine appreciation of opinions other than your own. And that one's very hard to test for. And I think in the end, that's the most important one, to determine the longevity of an employee and the long-term success of someone. Because you can only get so far by yourself. And it's if you are working with a group of other very talented, super ambitious people, the key is preventing everyone from stabbing each other in the face all the time. And so, yeah, I think that humility is a really important one. So I'm glad you mentioned it.
No, you're totally right. And that screening criteria, you're cutting against it with your first 2, right? So that's the problem, is so much of the way the world works. We tell people that if you want to be ambitious, if you are a smart person, if you're destined for great things, and it's also kind of okay, or maybe even necessary, to kind of be a jerk and be delusional in your thinking, because other people will make up the difference, pick up slack for you, and that social conditioning is really hard to throw off. And yet, if you really study the companies that have made any kind of meaningful impact in the world for the better, you'll always find that unusual combination, right? The servant leader, the humble but very ambitious person, the search for meaning, those are stand out very clearly in the research and literature on what makes a company great.
Yeah, you left out a warrior philosopher. That was my particular favorite. But yeah, I don't think that humility, I think it's often mistaken for meekness, as if it's basically just about sort of standing aside and being submissive. No, that's not humility. I think that's that's giving up. I think humility is about appreciating other opinions, but also defending your own. And to want to be right, but being right doesn't mean just accepting what other people say. It means actually fighting for the truth. And I don't think people typically think of humility as from sort of, it requires fighting, but it does.
Yeah, the respect for the truth, the determination to get to the truth. This is, it's the heart of the scientific method and so many of the other important intellectual breakthroughs of humanity. But it's right there. I was talking to someone who worked for one of these iconic leaders, who's very famous, and they were saying that the difference they had learned from that person was the difference between like some people actually try to find the right thing to do to be right. And other people are very focused on making sure that whatever it is that they decided to do turned out to be the right thing to do. So they just change the facts to make whatever they're doing right, because the feeling of righteousness is the most important thing, and the facts be damned. And I took a lot away from that if we're going to make progress, we're going to have an impact on the world, we have to be able to kind of stay present and really examine what is. And that's the most important thing you can say of a great scientist. You think of the most famous scientists, like a Feynman or Einstein, that they had a big ego for sure. They were successful. They were very determined, right? A lot of perseverance in there, but also a humility in face of the fact that we don't know everything, and we're trying to find out the truth. And it's what good is it to have a famous theory that everyone adheres to that turns out to be wrong? That's actually that's all of our worst nightmare, at least of the right kind of person. So I think that if you look at the history of human affairs and what are the things that really matter, these are the few people who had that right mix to be able to do something really important.
Well, so you mentioned you touched on success earlier, and so I'd be curious how you define success. Like from an Expensify perspective, we talk internally about our goal, like our mission here is to live rich, to have fun, to save the world. And it's like, and I don't think, kind of like humility is often mistaken for meekness. I think that business success is seen as a kind of a zero sum. Like you can't have fun and be successful in business. So you got to choose one or the other kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I view it's like from like a work-life balance perspective, it's not like, a teeter-totter where you have to choose one or the other, or one subtracts for the other. I think balance is more like, Maslow's hierarchy. It's like, if you want to achieve the top, you have to have a firm base. But anyways, I'd be curious how do you think about success? Because it sounds like you sort of struggled with that over time. Like you went for a particular vision of it, but then changed your mind.
Yeah, this is going to sound kind of stupid because, of course, if you study philosophy or, really listen to anybody who's been successful in history talk, everyone says that the pursuit of money and material things does not lead to happiness. And, I think like so many I remember growing up and being like, yeah, I'm sure that, I'm sure it's fine for you to say that, but it really helps, And I remember, I forget who it was, a famous actor, I think, said anyone who comes up to him and says that, they want advice about how to become rich and famous, he always tell them, well, why don't you try being rich first and see if that does it for you? You don't necessarily have to be famous too, do you? And all this is so much out there to find out what really matters in life. And then, of course, I was like, yeah, sure. And then as I had more success in my career, I had to have the same realization, I guess, as people have been having since for eons now, that meaning comes from the work that you get to do and the relationships that you get to forge and the whole life that you get to build. And, material success is nice. And I certainly feel very, very fortunate to, have had success. But most of the most important things that I have learned came from failure and like embarrassing and punishing failure. So yes, I can think of so many things that might have gone differently in my life that might have led to more worldly success in some way. But I feel like I would be so much poorer, so much, worse off if I had taken those alternate roads.
Well, so that's a great opening to some of those. What's one of those humiliating failures?
Oh yeah, let's talk about it. Because I feel like when so many people now, because of the work that I do, I sometimes get held up on this pedestal as some kind of a talking head professional expert about things. And I really subscribe to the Peter Drucker school. He said once, people call me a guru because they can't spell charlatan. And so I feel like let's get into it. Like if you want to follow the path of successful entrepreneurs, especially, boy, you better be ready for failure. And so I always, I feel like I'm on stage all the time being like, hi, everybody, I'm a big failure. And if you follow me, you too can be a big failure. Who's with me? Like, you're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to pretend that you know what you're talking about. You're supposed to pretend that your advice will lead to success. And yet, it's just, we know it's not true. So again, going back to respect for the truth. I have had more failure than success in my life, in my career. And I talked about being in school, as a young person getting into entrepreneurship during the dot-com bubble and having that experience of having a startup blow up in my face and having to tell people, you were right. It didn't work out. And I'll never forget when I applied so I thought, that was enough of that. I thought I was done with entrepreneurship and was going to now have to kind of go back to having a respectable, regular job. So I was applying for jobs around and especially wanted to come to Silicon Valley because that was like the mecca to me of the technology industry. And one of the startups that got my resume, called me for an interview, and they said, "Tell me about this terrible failure." And I was like, "Oh, so embarrassed." And they're like, "Okay, but what did you learn from the experience?" And I started going on and on about all the things I would have done differently, and all the things I had learned. And they said, "This is great. Now you've learned all those lessons on somebody else's dime. We didn't have to pay to educate you. Some other investor already paid." So it was such a revelation to me about the Silicon Valley ethos, which for all its flaws still has this real appreciation of the fact that there's going to be failure in the quest for greatness. But ironically, that startup, which I did go join, I was an early employee there and got to go on the rocket ship with them, was totally destroyed by its own hubris in so many other ways, and turned out also to be a really embarrassing failure. And now, not supposed to don't take investment advice from me, because as the startup eventually cratered and they started to lay people off, almost all the talented people went to Google. And so and this is pre-IPO Google back in the day when it was a small company. So the earlier you got laid off, the more money you made because you got to go to Google earlier. And I had all these friends at Google like, "Listen, we can't say exactly why, but you really should come over and maybe chat with one of our recruiters about working here because there's some pretty," and I'm
Just
like,
saying.
"Search engine, come on." And I did that for Facebook. I did that for Google, for Twitter, you name an iconic tech company from that era. I poo-pooed it and didn't want to go work there. So if you measure just by worldly success, I still have some of those offer letters. I could do the math on what those stock options were worth today.
Well, but I think that it's easy to look back on, the paths not taken and trim out all of the 100 times more paths that would have been even worse failures. It's like, clearly, I think you made this comment about like going up on stage. And it's like, follow me into being a failure like me. But like, that's, success is like 10 times more failure. And I think like, if you're not failing, you're just not on the path to success. It's like, there's just no way to get there without a tremendous amount of failure along the way.
Yeah, and sometimes people, people complain about that because, in Lean Startup, we talk about that really, really forthrightly. And I remember once I had this talk where this very intimidating, very large man was standing in the back of the auditorium. This is a very technical crowd, down in Cupertino kind of talk. And, he just was so angry as I was talking, and I could see it on his face that he was like everyone else is sitting and he's standing with his arms crossed, like really very angry person as I'm speaking. And I could tell he's not liking what I had to say. And so then during the Q&A period, he raises his hand and I'm just like dying to know, what is this guy's deal? I mean, I really want to know. And he's like, "Why do you talk so much about failure? Isn't our goal to succeed?" It was really emphatic and kind of like as if I was causing the failure by talking about it. And I've got that question a lot over the years because there's a lot of people who think that way. Through the power of your mind, you can create success and avoid failure. And I feel like they should go into astrology, because I was like, look, if you have the power to bend the universe to your will through the power of your mind, such that you will never succeed, what are you talking to me? You should be worth, go out and do whatever your dreams are, go make it happen. And listen, if you have a reliable, repeatable way to accomplish that, will you share it with me so I can tell all these other people? Because the rest of us poor schlubs, we don't do good. We're not very good at this, and our success rate is pretty low. And there are those people who have gone from success to success, and many of us, we wonder, do they have some kind of magic secret sauce that is there some occult ritual that you can do to prevent that? And if there is, I haven't heard about it. So, I feel like, well, I'm just going to do the best I can in the meantime. And if it one day is proved that success in business is somehow achievable with 100% accuracy, if my methods become obsolete, like, okay, I'll accept that. But so far, I don't feel like we're even close to that outcome.
Yeah. I mean, you go to the bookstore and you see the business section, you see Lean Startup, 1,000 other books about business. And it's basically like, well, which one's right? Like, they all sound very respectable and all super smart and so forth. And I think if your strategy to become a business success is to read the right book, it's like, man, it's not very good odds. There's like 1,000 of them. It's like the likelihood of picking the right one seems very slim. But also, like, when raising money, it always strikes me that it seems like the advice you get from a VC is always exactly the same. And it's always just like, I've really thought about your specific requirements and your particular need, and I think you should raise money. It's like, well, of course they're going to say that because they sell money. It's like going to a hot dog salesperson and being like, what should I do? And they're like, well, you should buy more hot dogs. It's like, that's of course what their advice is going to be. But
Yeah,
then
of course.
you take that VC advice and like, okay, so what fraction of the companies that took that advice succeeded? And it's like, about 10%. It's like, okay, so this book that you're advising me to do is like a 90% failure rate. But they're like, yeah, but it's higher than anyone else. It's like, oh my God, no one has any idea what they're doing here.
Yeah. I one of the most powerful things I learned was that when someone gives you feedback or is telling you something about yourself, it's actually not information about you, it's information about them. And this is so important because especially with Lean Startup, where we're putting out minimum viable products and we're testing ideas, like it can be very difficult to get feedback from people and have people say, this sucks, I hate it, you're stupid, you know what it's like to put software into the world. Like, you get all kinds of reactions from all kinds of people, and especially online. You go into I used to build products that had their own online forums, and so people would spend just hundreds of hours talking about all the ways in which they absolutely hated our product. And sometimes I'd be like, well, why don't you just please leave? You hate it so much. Why do you spend so much time tormenting me about how much you hate it? It's like, it's actually a kind of, and what you realize is when someone tells you they hate your product, they're actually saying something very interesting about themselves. It's critical information. They're saying actually there's something that they love in it. They're angry, but the anger is information that's really valuable. And you are not really you. You're just a character in their mental drama. And you need to understand what that means. And the same is true with VC. So yes, of course, a VC thinks that what you should do is whatever would be in their best interest. Like, no kidding. That's a very natural human thing to assume that whatever's best for me is best for everybody. It's not unique to VCs. We all do that. But if you take that away from like, oh, they're telling me what to do and I need to fight with them, and say, wait a minute, what have I just learned? You just learned something really important about the economics of that individual person and the firm that they represent, the product that they are trying to sell you. And in fact, I often tell entrepreneurs who are asking me for advice about fundraising that if the VC is not trying to convince you to do what would be best for them, they're probably not that interested. It's one of the ways you can tell if they're serious about wanting to invest in your company or not, because if they don't care, indifference, a no is bad, but indifference is a lot worse. And that same is true in products. But with everything, like you talked about screening for the right talent. If you have a really long-term perspective about what you're doing with your company or career or business, whatever it is that you're doing, then you want to polarize as much as you can. You want to find out like who's going to have a reaction to this, who's going to care enough about this mission that I'm on that they're going to be willing to persevere through the hard times. And so I used to think that like an interview that went well and there were no red flags and everything was fine was a good sign. And then I started to realize, no, actually like indifference is worse than someone who's like argues with you. And I think about like some of the best people I have ever hired really were pretty passionate and like thought I was pretty stupid, along the way. In some interview, they'd be like, you do things the wrong way. And they really cared, they wanted to get to the right answer. And, like there's people who can be hostile and not humble about that, in which case that's not helpful. But there's people who just can't help themselves. They really care. And, the saying that there's no zealot like a convert. Some people who even now today are like the biggest lean startup advocates out there in the world. I happen to remember when they thought it was just absolute rubbish. And that's okay. Like, because we learn new things and you don't have to get it right in the first go. And their intellectual contributions to it make it more interesting and are part of why they're so enthusiastic and passionate about it now. So that's true for ideas and movements, like Lean Startup, but it's also true for products and in business and in hiring and in so many other aspects of life.
So going back to this concept of success, I think you mentioned, you kind of hinted about the serial entrepreneur. People have like had success multiple times, and is there any sort of formula to it, or is it just flipping heads a few times in a row? Who knows? But I've always been struck by the idea of like this cult in Silicon Valley of the silicon entrepreneur, or the serial entrepreneur, as if that's the dream. And whereas I think if like if I said like I'm a serial parent. What I do is I start a family and then I leave. And then I go find someone else, start a new family, raise it, love it, and then I leave again. I've done it like 7 times in a row. I'd be like, you're a fucking monster.
That's a brutal metaphor.
Yeah, but the serial entrepreneur, I think we see is like, oh, it's so great. You build this company of wonderful employees that you care about, that you really do all this. And then you sell them to someone else again and again. And it's like, how can you how have you failed to make a company 7 times in a row that you didn't want to work for again? It's like, this just seems crazy. And so I think this, I don't know, I've always been struck by this idea of success and the misalignment of success in Silicon Valley, or maybe
Absolutely.
the ethos around it. I'd be curious for, you've been through the ringer a bunch of times, and you've talked with billions of companies about this. And like, what do you tell people about the idea of sort of serial entrepreneurialism and how it relates to success?
Yeah, it's interesting that we picked the word serial, which is a word you only really ever also use for a serial killer. And it is what you're doing. I mean, it is actually kind of grim if you think about it. Even the word exit is very existential. It's like, why would you celebrate an exit? I get what they're going for. The investors got to exit, so it's great for them. But I can't tell you how many. I know a lot of entrepreneurs, Valley entrepreneurs, who have sold a company and made unbelievable amounts of money and have terrible regret about it, and feel like, yes, they made all this money, but it was by a blood sacrifice. Yeah. And so people who think that's great and want to do it over and over again, that I got questions. And I think it all goes back to this question of, like, what does it mean to pursue something for the long term, right? To really have the ambition to change the world and have that not be a cliche or a joke, but something that you take really seriously. And to me, to be focused on the exit or the outcome or the destination is kind of to miss the magic or the wonder of what is possible with these companies when they're truly great. And I try to use that as a personal filter for, like, who do I want to be in business with, and what do I want to spend my time and energy with? We're only on this earth for a short time, and our efforts are precious. And so, where do I want to work? Who do I want to invest in? What companies do I want to advise or to partner with? We're looking for those rare, special people who really are passionately committed to the thing that they're doing. Now, I will say, though, that there is a subtle but I think important distinction, because while the image of the serial entrepreneur that you have raised is kind of grim, there is something new in the 21st century that I think is really cool, which is the possibility of pursuing entrepreneurship as a career. And that is a very recent development. If you read the stories of famous entrepreneurs from the 20th century or before, it's a very bizarre set of circumstances that allowed them to have their one shot. And generally they came from very privileged backgrounds. They met the society's dominant idea of how a successful person should look. They often had family money or connections that they could fall back on, even if they weren't super wealthy to begin with. And that was considered kind of okay. Like, it's just like, this is something that needs to happen. It's an aberration. It should happen rarely. And if it does happen, like, it's to be tolerated, but not especially welcomed. And so it wasn't a discipline that could be studied in its own right. You couldn't get a degree in it. You couldn't be certified to do it. And people didn't tend to do it over and over again unless they were working on basically the same company multiple times, like Henry Ford. Whereas now we really see the emergence of entrepreneurship as a relatively low risk career path compared to other career paths, which I think is very counterintuitive and very cool. It dramatically diversifies the set of people who can pursue entrepreneurship. And it recognizes the fact that you might be a serial entrepreneur involuntarily. That is to say, your company may fail and you may have to try again. That's not the same as, this kind of like rinse and repeat, build it, flip it, build it again behavior. And I do think that is really cool. In fact, now we're starting to see entrepreneurs who go in and out of big companies, which is even more strange. Henry Ford would have found this quite bizarre, but I know a lot of people now who have started a company. Maybe they sold it, maybe it failed, maybe they moved on because it outgrew them, or their company got acquired and they went to work for a big company, or they just got hired to be an innovation director or kind of what we call a corporate entrepreneur in the context of an existing company, or they get called to public service and they did entrepreneurial type work at a federal agency or in a city government. And then maybe they start another company and maybe they do it again. And the skills that they've developed, this ability to grapple with the unknown, that respect for truth that we were talking about, the ability to lead people into dangerous and uncertain waters, that skill set is actually very valuable. And especially in certain fields, it's become a more stable career than the so-called safe careers, which I find really fascinating. I know a lot of people who went into journalism or law or big company consulting or just any kind of big company job on the idea that was a safe and steady job, and find themselves at the mercy of this completely capricious and random bureaucracy who can fire you whenever it feels like, that has no care for your welfare, that doesn't share the economic rewards until you win the tournament at the end of your career and a bunch of other stuff. And so I think this is all kind of reshaping a 21st century idea of what is safe and what is risky from a career point of view. And then, of course, it really, if you measure by just financial terms, there's some question there because the variance makes it hard to calculate what's right for each person's individual circumstance. But if we ask ourselves, what is the more meaningful work? Then it really starts to slide, on the side of starting a company, but also going to work for a startup, going to work for the upstart, going to try to change the world, as you said earlier in our conversation. I think that's a very new, very exciting possibility.
And that idea that starting your own company is the safe choice is such a kind of radical and novel thing. Is that sort of a consequence, however, of new opportunity, or is it just a reflection of how volatile the times are? And that in the past, you could count on a career, you could be a lifetime employee of a factory, and that was a valid choice. And so now those options have just been kind of stripped away. And so is it a reaction to a loss of something, or is it enabling a new opportunity?
Well, as if all tech-enabled disruption, there's obviously both elements at play. But I think this is more positive than people realize, because the so-called stability of careers of the past, you just have to just read Death of a Salesman or any fiction from earlier periods, or just study, the battle for workers' rights. Like, the idea of stable employment was very limited to a pretty narrow class, of people who they would not have considered themselves aristocrats. But if you look at the totality of human society, these were people in the very upper echelons of economic stability. And that stability was bought at the price of a lot of negative consequences and negative externalities that they didn't have to deal with. But all that being said, I think there's also something genuinely new and exciting going on right now, which is the democratization of the tools of entrepreneurship. I kind of sometimes tongue-in-cheek called it the rentership of the means of production, turning Karl Marx's famous phrase on its head, because we have made it more and more and more possible through, all kinds of financing instruments and microloans and revenue-based financing. And, especially if you look at the international scene, all kinds of public-private partnerships, and just a just Cambrian explosion of new ideas about how new ideas should be funded. But then also the tools, the actual intellectual tools of how to run a startup, how to build a startup, how to raise money, how to hire, all this stuff. I mean, can you imagine listening to this podcast, when we were coming up in our careers in the early days, and how unbelievable it would have been to have this information? It was very rare. There weren't that many books about entrepreneurship written. There wasn't a lot of media coverage of Silicon Valley, from the inside. It was a very curated, very limited perspective. You wanted to know like how Microsoft was started or Apple was started. Like, that information was not widely available. And then, to your point, the selection bias of coverage was such that you didn't hear about the failures. You only heard about the glossy successes as told by corporate comms departments. So the advent of the internet and social media and the kind of the cult of personality around founders, for better or for worse. And, I like to think that the books have played some role here, but I think that that's just one piece of bringing this information out into the world. And then on top of that, you have the academic literature that has now shown really conclusively, without any shadow of a doubt, that entrepreneurship is the driver of economic development, pretty much in all regions, all countries, all times. This is where net new job growth comes from. It's where, well, anyway, I don't have to recap that literature. You can peruse it, anyone who'd like, or go read by Richard Florida or Annalise Saxenian. There's amazing research being done on this question. So there's this like all these like serious people and policymakers, and like have developed an interest in entrepreneurship as this kind of like quirky, strange thing that seems to have this like alchemy that can produce economic growth. And so all these pieces coming together is pretty wild. I'll show you one little story. The other thing that's incredible is the development of like an international cosmopolitan entrepreneurial class that has very similar habits and common values across time and space to a degree I really can't fathom. And I didn't appreciate this at all until the early days of traveling for the Lean Startup, as it started to become a phenomenon. I was very American based. I didn't travel very much. I never traveled for work before that. It was I had a very parochial view of the world. But I was asked to give a talk in Paris, and so I was I get in a cab and I give the Parisian surly cab driver the address, and they drop me off like vaguely in the vicinity of where I'm supposed to go, because the event venue is in one of these big mega blocks. I can't remember what they're called in French now. A big mega 4, 5, 6, 8 block radius, combined area. So you're supposed to just know where you're going. There's no addresses. There's no map. It's just, you're supposed to know. So I'm wandering around this huge complex, this huge, almost like a city within the city, trying to figure out where to go. And I see someone dressed like a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, like a tech guy with a ponytail and I can't remember what, geeky t-shirt on.
Patagonia vest, maybe.
Yeah. And I'm like, I'm gonna follow that guy, see where he's going. And as I'm following him, more such people appear. And there's like a guy in a Pink Floyd t-shirt. And then there's a guy, that's like, it was a very male dominated crowd, unfortunately, but like, I was like, this looks very, so I walk in and I'm like, trying to win it's like, where are you going? They're like, oh, we're here for the Eric Ries Lean Startup event. I'm like, that's me. I am in the right place. Hallelujah. And it was incredible. All these people speak perfect. They're all speaking French to each other. They've never been to the United States. Not a single one of them has set foot in Silicon Valley as far as I could tell, but they got the memo. And then I had an almost eerily identical experience in Japan, of all places. And I've now had this all over the world where there's new, I think it's the right way to think about it. It's a class consciousness around long-term thinking and prosperity and boldness and, the willingness to embrace being different. It's like bohemian artist movements of the past, except with an economic development agenda and a kind of normcore aesthetic. It's pretty interesting.
So how did all of that kind of contribute to the long-term stock exchange? Like, where did that idea come from, and how does this help promote that?
Oh, thanks for asking. So, yeah, long-term stock exchange is a national securities exchange, same kind of regulatory category as NYSE or NASDAQ, if you've heard of those. And our goal is for the next generation of companies, the people building capitalism 2.0, to give them the financial infrastructure they need to survive and thrive as public companies. Today, the way we have built our capital markets and our public markets kind of drags companies down into mediocrity, and it's a sad thing. And I got into this kind of an unusual way. My background, as we've been talking about, is in software development and product development and startups, not in finance. But when I used to give talks about Lean Startup, people would ask me about the intellectual origins of Lean Startup, and I always tell them about Toyota Production System and the kind of the legendary 20th century antecedents, and Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos, but especially Toyota, which has the philosophy of long-term thinking as a really expressed cultural commitment of the company. And the people who've researched this have really shown, the literature is really clear on this. If you don't have that long-term philosophy, you will not have economic growth over any sustained period of time. Like, it's just, you will descend into mediocrity and you will, have regression to the mean. So people would say, listen, hotshot, if you're trying to tell us to build the next Toyota and have a long-term perspective, how come you're also telling us to build venture-backed companies and take them public? And I tried all the kind of hand-wavy answers you give as an expert where you don't know the answer. And you're like, I'm sure there's some way that this can be resolved, and then I'm like, oh, let me get right back to you. And I would go, I started reading everything I get my hands on. I was like, I need to know the answer to this question. I'm sure someone has a good answer. I'm sure that the way that our capital markets was designed, that this is a solved problem. I just am too ignorant to know about it. And to me, that was like going down the rabbit hole. That isn't a solved problem. In fact, it's a known unsolvable problem that is destroying capitalism from the inside. And everyone who's really in the belly of the beast knows it, and just like there's nothing you can do about it. There's no point to do anything about it. It's like gravity. You don't complain about gravity. You just stay on the ground. And yet, if you look at the companies that have succeeded not because of, but in spite of these constraints, including, of course, famously Toyota, you find these very strange circumstances. Like Toyota has this very, by modern standard, very unusual old Japanese Keiretsu-style governance structure that we don't make new ones of these anymore. They've been grandfathered into the modern era. If you study the Amazon story, like how is it that Jeff Bezos came to have this level of control and influence over the company? It's a very strange set of circumstances that had to do with the exact timing of when they raised money in the crazy dot-com bubble and crash. So you find these exceptions, these outliers, but if you are an entrepreneur saying, well, I want to follow in those footsteps, it's not really clear. You can't really count on those same exceptional circumstances applying to you. And I just thought that can't be right. We have to be able to do better. So, I had the idea. I mean, I was literally on a plane. The 2 years before Lean Startup was published in 2011, I was traveling nonstop, workshops, speeches, working with companies. I mean, I was testing and refining the ideas all the time. And then like on the plane, I would be reading business books and then working on the manuscript. That was like my whole life. I just ate and breathed business books. And mainly it was, to your point about humility, I was terrified that I didn't have anything new to say. And therefore, if I read enough business books, I would eventually find like some old out of print Peter Drucker book that said everything that I was trying to say already. And then I'd be like, well, great. I just need to get this book back in print. I'm like relieved of my obligation to write this book at all. I remember that Peter Drucker, in fact, has an out of print entrepreneurship book that I couldn't get my hands on. It took me a long time to track down a used copy of it. And I remember thinking, well, boy, I'm so terrified that if I read this, this is it. My fledgling career as an expert is over. But if you've read that book, you'll understand it's not the solution. But anyway, so I was reading all these books about Toyota. I was writing about the need for long-term thinking. And I just had this epiphany one day. I was literally just sitting in an airplane seat saying, wait a minute. If it's true that long-term oriented companies are more successful, they serve customers better, that means they're going to make more money. And most of the money in our capital market system comes from very long-term people, namely people who are saving for retirement. So why would Wall Street, who's supposed to be investing these people's money for retirement, why would it be pressuring companies to make less money? It's like the opposite of the caricature you have. And it hit me. I was like, oh, got it. We have wedged ourselves into this situation where the incentives of all these intermediaries drive towards short-term decision-making, short-term pressure, but that is not actually right from first principles. And therefore, you don't just need a new law to solve this problem. You can make money solving it. Like, this is actually an entrepreneurial opportunity. And of course, I wasn't thinking this is something I would have to do. Somebody, I wrote this in the book, go grab your old beat up copy of The Lean Startup. If anyone listening, you have one, it's on the last page of the book, right there in the epilogue. It's right. It says somebody should really build a long-term stock exchange. And I sketched out from first principles how it should happen. And then it didn't happen. And I kind of understand why now. It's like not exactly the most fun,
really dealing with the SEC sounds like a blast. So
yeah.
What would you say distinguishes sort of your eventual design for the long-term stock exchange from the current design of like New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ?
Yeah. So there's nothing wrong with the incumbent exchanges per se. It's just a business model alignment issue. Most of the money that is made by the financial system today comes from stock trading, which is an inherently short-term activity. So if you list your company on a conventional stock exchange, you're not really the customer, you're the product. Mm-hmm. Just like if you use Google for free, you're not the customer. The people who pay the money are the customer. And so the traders are the customers. And so if you look at our markets, we have built the most unbelievably efficient market in the history of mankind, for trading 100-share lots in microseconds. So small lots, fast trading, like we are unparalleled at it. But how does that actually benefit the companies who are what are called the issuers of the security in the system? Like actually all that volatility, all that activity is damaging to companies more than it's helpful. Now, companies want to be able to access the liquidity of public markets, and that is really important. But that there's kind of this synthetic liquidity, this like fake liquidity of the same shares being traded back and forth very rapidly. That's not really helping companies think, pursue greatness. So I thought, let's build an exchange that has its incentives aligned properly, so that its goal is to build more and better great companies, and then let us have the listing standards of the exchange require companies to comply with the things that we know generate those good outcomes. So ultimately, our view, we're not trying to blow up the system. We are integrating in the system. We're reformers, not radicals. The listing on LTSE, you still get complete access to the liquidity of our American capital markets. You can even dual list. You can list on NASDAQ or NYSE and then have LTSE be the secondary exchange. Like we've really gone out of our way, and it's why it's taken so many freaking years to bring it to market, to be completely compliant with all the appropriate regulations, to win over all the different stakeholders, including traders, who we're not opposed to or angry at. It's just, they have a different role to play in the system than companies and the long-term investors. And so if you're a company and you want to prove to the world that you actually stand for something good, that you are a purpose-driven company, that you are going to care about sustainability, and you're going to care about diversity and inequality, and you're going to treat your employees, your communities, your stakeholders with respect, how do you make promises that the public can believe? How do you win the public's trust? if your commitments are not binding. This is the thing I don't get. Like, people sign these pledges and they have all these letters and manifestos and things. And it's like, but those just rely on your good intentions. And the public has become increasingly skeptical of those good intentions because so many companies that started out with lofty goals through these bad incentives have, been reduced to pretty malign actors. Mm. So I think this next generation really wants and can accomplish something different. And like I said at the beginning, we want to be the financial infrastructure that can support that.
So you said it ultimately came down to a lack of business model alignment of like the exchange with the traders. How is the business model long-term stock exchange different?
Oh, this is great. We make our money by charging companies money for services that they want to buy. That's it. It's real simple. It's like, that's how you make money. How many times have I had this conversation with a CEO? You make money because your service is valuable to your customers. They voluntarily pay you money for it. And we have that same crazy idea that we're going to make software and products that you will choose to buy from us because they are worth something. And because of the quirk of the fact that we get to build a new exchange from scratch using modern technology, our cost structure is dramatically better than what's come before. So we don't need to make all this money from trading in order to be a viable business. We just need companies to grow with us.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think you're saying about if you're not the customer of the product sort of thing, and you're saying, oh, I talk to CEOs and you sell products to customers. But going back to what we talked about earlier, that's not really the case. For most CEOs, they're preparing one sale, the sale of their company, the sale of their family and their children, basically, to someone else. And so I'd be curious, actually, we've talked about there's no proven success model for like an entrepreneur to achieve success. But when it comes to employees, how reliable is the strategy of joining a startup to get rich? Like the people what fraction of people who start down that path actually end up with that pot of gold?
Yeah. I don't know if you know the history of the World Series of Poker. But the World Series of Poker is like a massive, international poker event. I can't remember. I think it cost $10,000 to buy in. And now it's a huge event. Thousands of players fly from all over the world. Anyway, it was one of the early, like, kind of card table type sports that was televised on ESPN. It became a big phenomenon. Anyway, I can't remember what year, but there was a certain year where a guy his actual name is Chris Moneymaker, an amateur player, won the tournament live on ESPN and won however many millions of dollars was the prize. And the next year, 10,000 wannabe Chris Moneymakers were in the tournament every year. And here's the crazy thing about it. This is, I just think it's so good that we have these sports analogies that we can look to see how some of our kind of ideas about business are kind of silly. So poker is a game of skill. And there are professional poker players who are so much better than an amateur that they can support themselves, making a lot of money just by playing poker all the time. And yet, for many, many, many years, no professional player won the World Series of Poker after the influx of amateurs from Chris Moneymaker's event. I haven't kept up with it, so I don't know if the streak is still unbroken. But it was a very long time when no professional player won the tournament. And it was often these random amateurs who would win. And so you could look at that and say, see, it's not really a game of skill. Or you say, all these books you read and all the skill you develop, it won't avail you. Or if you have a slightly more sophisticated understanding of probability, you would say, gosh, the probability of winning this tournament with such a wide field with the amount of variance that is involved in poker it's extremely low. And so the best, what they call game theory optimal play of poker can improve your winning percentage and magnitude by a few percentage points. Now, over a long period of time, that's the difference between becoming, extremely wealthy and busting out. But on any given day, in any particular hand, and in any particular tournament, it's not enough to overcome the natural variance of the cards. And if you think poker has high variance, you should try entrepreneurship. Okay, like we're talking about one of the highest variance activities that anyway is known to mankind. It is unbelievable because sometimes you start a company and you make $100 billion, and most of the time you don't get anything at all. You just languish in mediocrity and then it dies. And so the odds are really, really stacked against you, but the rewards are potentially tantalizingly, crazy. So I think if your goal is to make money, is not a good career path. I mean, I really think there are better, more secure ways to make money. Go be a corporate lawyer or investment banker or something. Like there's certain career paths that just have a much more practically guaranteed income stream attached to them. But entrepreneurship is unique in that it does offer these rewards. I mean, it is not quite like playing the lottery, and here's why. Yes, it has the same economic payout structure as the lottery, that is small amounts invested can yield disproportionate returns, but only to the lucky few. But playing the lottery is not a valuable activity in itself. It's actually a waste of time. It's not intellectually stimulating, and you can't get any kind of meaning out of it. But you can get that out of entrepreneurship. It's actually an extremely meaningful kind of work. And you asked me kind of how I judge my own personal success now that I've had a little more time to think about it since when I was younger. And to me, I really try to ask myself, what is something I would like to work on where even if we fail, it'll have been worth it. I'll sleep easy at night. Like, I have young kids now, so I really think a lot about when they're old enough to understand what I did for a living during this time. What do I want to tell them I was working on? Ad optimization, tricking people into clicking banner ads like slightly better than the other guy. Like, no disrespect, but no, I don't want to tell them that. I want to be able to say I was working on something that really mattered. That, as you said, was something I would try to change the world for the better. And so if you use that standard and ask yourself, like, what's the career path that's going to give you most exposure to that kind of work? I do think there are other career paths to consider, but most of the ones that kind of have wealth and fame attached to them don't really. So it's an unusual combination of, like, it's still business. There's still opportunities for financial reward, and you can tackle problems that require financial systems to be engaged and reformed in order to achieve your goals, which makes it distinct from political activism or nonprofit work, as valuable and important, as meaningful as that kind of work is. Here you have this very unusual combination that, like, it can be meaningful and rewarding, and the work you do, even in failure, can make a big difference.
So speaking of long term, one last question. What's your take on the singularity, and how do you prepare for it?
Okay, I have kind of an unusual take here, because of course for those who don't know the singularity argument, the idea is that we could first of all, we could be living a simulation right now. You wouldn't know. And the reason it's practically inevitable that we will be is that if you follow the exponential increase of computational power that we have at our disposal, pretty soon we should get to a point where the new machines that we build can themselves build new machines better than the machines that we can, faster than we can. And so the acceleration of technology will happen so fast that, like, human consciousness will be left behind in some form. And it's like it's called singularity because it's like a discrete event beyond which we cannot see the future that unfolds. And so the problem with the singularity argument is kind of like all ontological arguments, in philosophy, that, like, it seems kind of untestable. It's like, if this was an illusion, if we're actually asleep right now and we're not alive, or if you're living in the Matrix and no one else is real but you, like, how would you be able to know, and how would that affect your behavior in any way, even if you did know that was true? It's kind of fatalistic. But if you buy into the singularity thesis and therefore buy into the simulation hypothesis, then and just for people to know, like, if the singularity is real, then it's likely that some percentage of singularity enhanced AI powered civilizations would want to do what they call ancestor simulation. So they want to know what happened in the past with great precision. So they would simulate, with all their infinite computational power, they would simulate all the consciousnesses that have ever lived. That would include you and me. We are their ancestors, probably. And so just probabilistically, if you look at all the multiple possible paths of the future, we're probably living in a simulation right now. But I don't think it's a purely ontological argument, and here's why. If it's true that we are living a simulation right now, then I bet you there are bugs and glitches in the code that was written. And so I think it's actually should be considered a branch of physics, simulational physics, where we try to break the simulation to find out, it's like you think about, like, wave particle duality and, like, all these Planck limits, and, like, there's all these weird rules in subatomic physics that are those engineering optimizations? Because, like, this is kind of weird, some weird stuff. So my personal take is, like, that if someone really is serious about it, they should go investigate to try to figure out what kind of hardware are we running on, and otherwise just live your life.
Yeah, because I'm excited to do an escalation attack on that and see what's on the other side.
Wouldn't you want to know?
I just got deja vu. Anyway, little Matrix joke for you there.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Is he the one?
Eric, thanks again for taking the time to join us today on our podcast. A couple quick other things to cover before we let you go. The name of the podcast, as David mentioned earlier, is Live Rich, Have Fun, Save the World. We view our success not only as a business, but in our personal lives here at Expensify through the lens of those three concepts. And kind of a tradition on this podcast, we like talking to the guest, asking the guest what those three concepts mean to you. How do you live rich? How do you have fun? And how do you foresee yourself ultimately saving the world?
Whew. I feel incredibly lucky and blessed to get to do what I do. I mean, it's ridiculous. And if I had been born into almost any other era in history, like I'd probably be dead. Like I have, my skills would not be valued or useful. I certainly would not be in the. I mean, it's such a miracle of the accident of birth and genetic endowment and timing and everything. So I feel like getting to do this work at all is its own reward, and the fact that on top of that, it also has led to materials. I mean, just come on, it's absurd. And I'm very grateful to everybody who's had a hand in making that happen. And yet I'm kind of dissatisfied with the state of our world. And especially recently, it's just been awful. And I think there's actually something really dark in the fact that kind of saving the world has become a cliche or a joke or a throwaway line. I don't know. I feel like there used to be a much more serious idea that this is like the honorable work. This is what virtue requires. And in fact, those to whom most is given, most is expected to have that responsibility as the kind of elite of the world, to take care of it, to hold it in trust for future generations. And I don't know, maybe it's because I became a parent, maybe it's because this has been a particularly awful time of late in world affairs. For whatever reason, I feel like our generation of elite leaders is just fallen down on the job, and have been for a little while, of really trying to take care of the civilization that we have inherited. And so I really hope, like, the reason I am so passionate about LTSE and all the work that I do is not just that I hope it succeeds on its face. Like, of course, I hope the lean startup movement is successful and transforms business. I hope LTSE is successful as a business and does all this stuff. But I also want to kind of show people that change is possible in the civic fabric of our society itself. Our major institutions that govern our lives need to be reinvented. We can't just rerun the playbook that our grandparents figured out after they went through some pretty dark times, because the world is different in the last 100 years, but the parallels, the rhymes are a little bit disturbing. And I mean, we're about to enter the real roaring 20s, I think. And we all know what happened after that last time. So I think we got to get ready and start to get more serious about the fact that saving the world is not a joke. If we don't make some major changes, we're headed for dystopia, and ecological collapse, and so many other problems that are going to make 20th century look like a walk in the park. So I hope that more and more people will take on the mantle of entrepreneurship, not just as a business proposition, but as a civic proposition, and that this new generation of leaders will be able to stem the tide and steer our civilization in a better direction.
Well said. Well said, Eric. We'll leave it there. That's a great note to leave off on. Let the people know where they can find you and where they can follow along with the work that you're doing.
Sure. LTSE is highly regulated, so to get the details, you should go to ltse.com, where you can see all of our regulatory disclaimers, as well as keep up to date on our progress. You can find me on Twitter. I'm ERICRIES, or theleanstartup.com.
Live Rich, Have Fun, Save the World is brought to you by Expensify. Hosted by David Barrett and Monte Barnard. Engineered and produced by Monte Barnard. Theme song by DJ Mick. Please rate, review, and subscribe to Live Rich, Have Fun, Save the World on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you happen to be listening. Head to Expensify.com to sign up for a free trial and see just how easy it is to automate your entire pre-accounting process. Expensify. Easy money.